This is Iraq. Look at us blowing up. Nobody showing up. Nobody owing up. هذا العراق بدايتك اخرتك جوازك اخرتك وين جوازك بس دير بالك لك لا تغلط. This is Iraq. Look at us blowing up. Look how I'm throwing up. Prime Minister on the...
Guys, what's good? So I'm actually doing this from my office today. So I feel a little bit discombobulated. I got so used to doing it at home. So the cup for today, nothing special. Got Dunkin' Donuts. I should get paid for this. Alright, so for today, again, we're going to do three things. So one, we're going to look at the post-Cold War world and look at how the United States has gotten involved in conflicts around the world, including the Middle East, particularly after 9/11. And we're going to focus on the U.S. intervention in Iraq in particular. We're also going to look at how the United States justified its intervention in Iraq by referencing international institutions, international norms. And we're going to show, third, we're going to show how the U.S. approach and justification for international relations changed after 9/11 as encapsulated in the Bush Doctrine, a large part of which is laid out in NSS 2002, which was one of the recommended readings. Very long reading, but it's worth parsing through and taking a look at it. So we're going to start with Iraq. So the invasion in Iraq started in March 19, 2003, with the launch of what was called Operation Shock and Awe, which was an attempt to devastate the Iraqi army, in particular the Iraqi Republican Guard, and overwhelm their military to have a relatively quick victory. And the idea was that because the United States was so far advanced in terms of military and technological capability, that the war was going to be easy and fairly straightforward, the actual combat part of the war. At the height of the war, the height of the intervention, there was 170,000 United States troops based in Iraq. The troops formally withdrew in 2011 under the Obama administration, and headed through Kuwait to be, sent home. Now, unfortunately, United States troops are still in Iraq. The difference is because the war was formally over, or the intervention was declared formally over, we have not been able to have good information on how many troops are in Iraq and what exactly they're doing. So we're still involved in Iraq, just like we're still involved in Afghanistan. The primary difference is we don't really know to what extent now as opposed to before. Now, this is an interesting thing to talk about, right? The intervention in Iraq, considering that I'd mentioned the global war on terror, which started after militants associated with the Taliban, which is based in Afghanistan, attacked the United States. So what does the invasion of Iraq and Operation Shock and Awe tell us about the US's response to Afghanistan, and what does this mean for international relations? Was this an aberration? Did this mark the start of some new approach to international relations, as many people argued, and as in fact was argued in NSS 2002? Or was this terrorist attack really just more of the same? Why did this intervention have to occur? And so to understand this, we have to go back and take a look, of course, at what happened at 9/11 and how that got associated to Iraq. So the attack on 9/11 was, of course, so far the most serious terrorist attack, outside terrorist attack, on the United States. About 3,000 people were killed on that one day alone, which is the largest number of people killed in by a terrorist attack. It was a very visceral and visually gripping event. You guys don't remember it, but I remember it pretty well. I remember watching it on television, turning on the TV and seeing the first tower on flames, and just being kind of confused about what was happening. And then as I was watching it, the other plane just came out of nowhere, crashed into the second tower. There was just like this flash and then this big explosion. And then, it like just kind of struck me at that moment what exactly was taking place. And the rest of the day, to be honest, was kind of a blur to me. I was in Massachusetts at the time. I was at UMass Amherst, and it was just, especially when I heard about the attack on the Pentagon, and then the other plane that went down. I want to say in Pennsylvania. It was this bizarre, shocking, and bewildering day, and it was for many people, as we saw with the United States response. I mean, you had like terror alerts that were color coded and things like that. It was a bizarre time. So, keeping that in mind, right, we have this attack by a foreign entity, right, the Al Qaeda, which was associated with the Taliban. It wasn't exactly the Taliban, but they were a militant group that was based in Afghanistan, that was essentially given free rein to train and to mobilize and so on by the Taliban. So there were two different entities, but they were affiliated. And Al Qaeda was made up of foreign nationals. It was a transnational organization, so it was mostly Saudis, but you had members from other nation states as well, including Afghanistan, right? But it was not an Afghanistan. It was not a Taliban organization. So you remember when we spoke about NATO and how NATO was designed as a collective defense organization. So the principle of collective defense organizations, of course, is that an attack on one by an outside actor is an attack on all members. And for the first time in history, after the United States was struck, NATO invoked Article 5, which we had spoken about before, which justified an intervention by other members of the organization to this attack. So that's the only time that Article 5 has been invoked so far in NATO's history. And with the support of NATO members and the essential acquiescence of the United Nations Security Council, the United States retaliated against Afghanistan and created this intervention, this war in Afghanistan, to respond to the attacks of 9/11. Now, that still doesn't exactly answer why am I talking about Iraq in the context of an invasion by primarily Saudi nationals in a transnational organization that was based in Afghanistan. And it certainly doesn't answer why the United States invaded Iraq in response to this attack by this non-Iraqi organization, this non-state actor. To understand how the invasion in Iraq got associated with the attack by Al Qaeda, this transnational organization based in Afghanistan, we need the Wayback Machine to look at the history of the United States, the relationship with Iraq, the relationship with Iran, and their relationship with Saddam Hussein. So we'll use the Wayback Machine to go back to the 1980s. So, alright, so 1980, Iraq invaded Iran in response to what Saddam Hussein perceived of as threats by Iran to Iraq's regional power. And the ironic part of this was that during the 1980s, as this intervention started, Iraq was actually being aided by the United States. And the article by Mearsheimer Walt talks about the geopolitical calculations that was made by the United States about having a supportive Iraq in the region in order to counterbalance against Iran, which the U.S. perceived of as threatening to Israel and as well threatening to the United States itself, potentially threatening to the United States, particularly after the Iran hostage crisis. So, in short, the relationship between Iraq and Iran has stemmed over conflicts over territory and a desire for regional power. And one of the proximate causes for this conflict, starting in 1980, was the dispute of the Shatt al-Arab, which is a waterway between Iran and Iraq. And so it's obviously a very important waterway, for transportation, for access to the sea and so on, right? Like a pretty significant waterway. In addition to being access to water, right? Which matters. So Iraq was also, or Saddam Hussein was also worried about Iran's support for domestic terrorist groups within Iraq, Al-Dawa, for instance, was a terrorist group based in Iraq that Iraq believed had ties to Iran. These were two regimes of different ideologies. They certainly seemed to be antagonistic to one another, or at least justifying this antagonism on the basis of these appeals to who really represents the Muslim world and so on. And neither of these countries had any great deal of love for one another. So even though Iran had a much larger army than Iraq, Saddam Hussein believed that his army had the technological capability, the mobilization and so on, to launch and win a quick war against Iran. The problem was that, especially for Iraq, was that they didn't have a great technological understanding, or more appropriately, an organizational understanding of how to use artillery and tanks, mobile mechanized units together effectively. And so even though they had more technological development than Iran, they would do things like use tanks as essentially artillery. So they had tanks that were mobile, but they would just park them and use them to fire at the Iranian army. They would not support their equipment appropriately, so tanks were not always supported with air power and so on. And as a result, because Iran was able to send many of their soldiers over in human waves, even though sometimes they weren't always well equipped, their great numbers combined with the Iraqi poor organization made the war much more of a stalemate than Saddam Hussein had planned for, and that possibly could have happened if they were better organized. So you had a series of trench warfare where Iran would dig itself down into trenches, and the Iraqi army, because of poor organization, was unable to crush these trenches and move into Iran as they had planned, and the war dragged on for years. The war began to resemble more of World War I than World War II, where you'd have stalemates and trench warfare for much of the conflict. It resembled World War I, or more resembled World War I in another way, which is that Iraq began using chemical weapons against Iran starting in the early 1980s. Now, the US administration was supporting Iraq a little bit covertly during this period. So Donald Rumsfeld, for instance, who later served in the administration of George W. Bush, was an envoy sent to Iraq to support Iraq during this time period, or to show United States support to Iraq. Publicly, the United States criticized the use of chemical weapons against Iran by Iraq during this time period. In private, however, the United States took a variety of efforts to ensure that they continued supporting Iraq, allowing them to use chemical weapons. For example, they delisted Iraq as a state sponsor of terrorism, which it had been doing throughout the Cold War prior to this time period. By delisting Iraq as a state sponsor of terrorism, they were able to get Iraq to have loans from the Export-Import Bank. They began transferring technology, what was called dual-use technology, to Iraq, in particular helicopters, with the justification that helicopters could be used for civilian reasons, transportation, traffic reports, and things like that. Helicopters, of course, can also be used for military reasons, and so Iraq used helicopters for their chemical warfare against Iran, and then later against the Kurds during the 1980s. And so, despite the fact that they publicly criticized the use of chemical weapons, in private, they were willing at least to turn a blind eye, precisely because the US believed that Iraq could act as a bulwark against Iran. Now, that doesn't get into the Iran-Contra scandal, in which the United States administration also began selling arms to Iran. That might be another story, but that's also worth looking at. So anyway, you have this long stalemate between Iran and Iraq, public condemnation of the use by Iraq of chemical weapons, while continuing to accept the Iraqi use of chemical weapons during this crisis. And really international revulsion, especially by the United States against Iraq for using chemical weapons, didn't really start until Iraq used chemical weapons against Kurdish civilians, believing that while they were in this conflict with Iran, they might as well take care of this other potential conflict or potential threat to Iraqi sovereignty by wiping out the Kurds at the same time. So eventually the war ended. The United Nations Security Council, especially after the attack on civilians, pushed both sides to negotiate peace. This was supported as well by Saudi Arabia. We had a UNSC resolution calling for an end to conflict. Even worse, Iraq was financially devastated by the conflict. They were heavily indebted. They had borrowed a lot to finance the war. They had not gotten the material gains that they had hoped for. They were unable to attain full control over the Shatt al-Arab. They had borrowed money from Kuwait. They were now militarily vulnerable to other potential rivals in the region because they had spent so much on this conflict. And as an oil exporting country, they had shared a border, or they share a border with Kuwait, and they were aware or they suspected that Kuwait was pumping oil, as another oil exporting country, from oil fields that were in Iraq, or at least crossing the border with Iraq. And concerned about the fact that Kuwait might be making things more difficult for Iraq to financially recover, especially given the fact that it has other rivals in the region, Iraq began thinking about an invasion of Kuwait. Now, as Mearsheimer and Walt point out, Saddam Hussein was very aware that any invasion or any military intervention in the Middle East could potentially come with serious consequences, especially since they had been so heavily criticized near the end of the Iran-Iraq War by the United States for using chemical weapons. So in order to get a sense of what the likely political response would be, Iraq reached out to the United States, in particular Ambassador April Glaspie, in a diplomatic meeting to see what it would mean for a potential conflict between the nations. And April Glaspie famously said that the United States had no opinion on Arab conflicts. So you have Saddam Hussein concerned about regional weakness, getting signals from the United States that they wouldn't intervene. This, of course, is during the Cold War, right, or at least coming up near to the end of the Cold War, when the history of the UN Security Council indicated that the UN Security Council was unable to authorize interventions without having the US and the USSR on the same side, which historically had not happened. You have a history of support by the United States for Iraq for at least part of the 1980s. And what Mearsheimer and Walt point out is that Saddam's calculation that maybe they should invade Kuwait was actually a potentially prudent calculation of interests based on the signals and the information that he had at the time, or that any reasonable person could have made or assumed at the time. The problem, however, is that Kuwait was a member of the United Nations. The United Nations is a collective security organization. The Cold War had ended, so the Soviets were not quite as invested as in stymieing the United States at every turn. In fact, the Soviets didn't exist anymore. It was Russia now. And despite April Glaspie's indication that the United States was not concerned about Arab conflicts, the reality is they were, in part because this conflict would have destabilized oil prices, in fact did destabilize oil prices. So Saddam Hussein authorized an invasion of Iraq 4 months after the meeting with April Glaspie. The United Nations responded to this intervention by using a Chapter 7 authorization, identifying the Iraqi invasion as a threat to international peace, and authorizing what was called all necessary means by UN members to restore the international peace. Now, usually, whenever the United Nations and the UN Security Council have authorized a military intervention into some kind of conflict-threatening international peace, they use the phrase "all necessary means." Now, all necessary means does not mean you have to intervene through military means in an emergent conflict. It just means that if member states wish to use military force for an intervention, they are allowed to do so, or justified in doing so under the United Nations Charter. So we have the intervention led primarily by the United States, wipes out a large part of the Iraqi army. You have these scenes in which Iraqi troops traveling over a highway are attacked by air power, led primarily by the United States, but not only by the United States. They lost tens of thousands of soldiers in the conflict. I think the US lost like a few hundred at the most, or something like that, and many of them were lost by friendly fire. I mean, it was a complete rout of the Iraqi army. There were scenes in which Iraqi soldiers were dug into trenches, and the United States led used tanks to just push dirt onto Iraqi servicemen, burying them alive. Just a complete wipeout of the Iraqi army. Now, as a result of this authorization by the United Nations, the UN and the UN Security Council eventually authorized a ceasefire. The Iraqi army was beaten, they were pushed out of Kuwait, and Saddam Hussein surrendered. Now, the United States was concerned at this time about Iraq's potential military growth again, seeing their expansionist inclinations not only against Iran but now against Kuwait, and also being aware of their use of chemical weapons. And so, concerned about Iraq's development of weapons of mass destruction, the conditions of the ceasefire as negotiated by the United Nations call for continued monitoring by the international society of what Iraq's capabilities were, not only in terms of developing conventional weapons and where conventional weapons, what the range of conventional weapons were, but also what types of weapons would be used by Iraq. So Resolution 687 by the United Nations Security Council established as a condition of the ceasefire, right, as a condition of not continuing to attack the Iraqi army, which was again being completely obliterated, that Iraq would have to commit to disarmament, stop developing weapons of mass destruction, and even though they would be allowed to maintain a military for obvious reasons, that their military's capabilities would be reduced. So, for example, they were not allowed to develop a program that would lead to nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. They were to allow formal weapons inspections by the United Nations, in particular a monitoring program called UNSCOM, that Iraq must not sponsor terrorism, that Iraq had to not be hostile against member states, and that they would comply with the United Nations in all of these efforts to monitor Iraq's potential military capabilities and expansionist capabilities. And so the United Nations, under UNSCOM and supported by the International Atomic Energy Agency, led by Hans Blix, began monitoring Iraq in 1991. So they would do things like, go around to suspected weapon sites, monitor equipment, measure the capabilities of weapons, missiles that they had been developed to ensure that Iraq could not attack Israel, for so on. And in other words, to just keep an eye on Iraq's development. Now, in 1998, Iraq began stonewalling inspectors, perhaps with reason. I mean, you have to remember, of course, that Iraq was, as I mentioned, in a region in which it had rivals throughout the Middle East, especially Iran. Here you have this kind of invasive intervention in which an international organization is broadcasting to the world that Iraq's military development was being hamstrung by international organizations. So they began stonewalling inspectors, stopping them from getting access to certain sites, preventing them from carrying out their duties. In response to this, the United Nations passed Resolution 1441, and that was kind of the core of the reading by Colin Powell that I had assigned for you guys. Resolution 1441 said that Iraq had to comply with UN monitoring programs or face serious consequences. And in response to this resolution, which was passed 2002, Iraq the following year began reopening its borders to UN inspectors. They began turning over more documents, and there was this famous 12,000-page 12,000-page release from Iraq to the international society and to UN monitors in order to indicate what weapons and weapon system they had been developing, all in the supposed interest of transparency. And what the new data showed was that Iraq had in fact violated or potentially violated some of the agreements that they had signed under UN Resolution 687. So, for example, some of the missiles that Iraq had developed in between 1991 and 2003 had a range of 163 kilometers. Under Resolution 687, however, they were supposed to have missiles that had a maximum range of 150 kilometers. So this, of course, exceeded their permitted range. There was a discrepancy in the amount of chemical bombs that had been measured by Iraq prior to the war and those that were discovered either to have been destroyed or accounted for in some other way by the United Nations at this time. This discrepancy was about 6,500 chemical bombs. There was a total of 1,000 tons of chemical weapons that were also similarly not accounted for, including nerve gases like VX gas. There was an unaccounted for production of growth media, basically what you need in order to develop anthrax. And they had discovered a series of aluminum tubes, or I guess, as you Americans would say, aluminum tubes, right? And the argument they had made was that these aluminum tubes could potentially have been used in the development of nuclear weapons. In other words, these tubes were refined to such an extent that they could serve as the kind of tubes you use in centrifuges to refine nuclear material to the extent that it could be used for a nuclear bomb. So again, you have these aluminum tubes that could be used for anything, including possibly nuclear processing. You have a lot of gaps of information, things that you don't know, what the exact situation is, and you do have some evidence that some of the requirements that they had agreed to under Resolution 687 were not being met. So for Colin Powell and the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration at the time, this to them was used as justification that Iraq was not complying with the obligations of 687, and that therefore, by not complying with these obligations, that the ceasefire established under 687 was therefore null and void. And Colin Powell, in referencing Resolution 1441, in that speech that I had you guys read, said throughout that no one was under any illusions about what serious consequences meant. Now, the problem, of course, was that Colin Powell and the Bush administration used the argument that serious consequences meant a justification of military force. The problem is that the United Nations Security Council historically did not use serious consequences to justify military intervention. They would always use the phrase, all necessary means, as a way of authorizing U.S. military intervention, or UN rather, military intervention. So the fact that they were using this language and extending what the United Nations meant by this was a bit of a problem for the UN itself. And as a result, Secretary General Kofi Annan later said that the invasion of Iraq, which was justified by Resolution 1441 and Resolution 687, was illegal, even though the United States said specifically that it was legal because they were using it in reference to these UN resolutions. Problematically for the UN, however, the UN does not have an army. It had no way of sanctioning the United States or creating some kind of condemnation of the United States for what seemed to be an inexorable drive towards war. In particular, they could not use the UN Security Council to issue any kind of resolution condemning the United States because the United States was a permanent member on the UN Security Council. So a resolution through the UNSC would have been impossible. Even one as simple as saying, don't do this, this is a bad idea, right? Further, the United Kingdom was supporting the United States in their use of this kind of dubious argument about the connection between, or the development of Iraq, of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. Another element to this as well, another part of the justification of going to war in Iraq, was association between Iraq and global terrorism, right? State-sponsored terrorism. And again, if you remember, Resolution 687, as I had mentioned, specifically said that Iraq was not supposed to sponsor state terrorism. And this, of course, is taking place in the context now of post 9/11, right? The 9/11 attack. Now, for Colin Powell and for people in the Bush administration, they argued that there was a clear tie between Iraq and Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And part of the evidence that they had used to make this assertion was that some of the terrorists who were associated with Al-Qaeda were discovered in Iraq or were suspected to have been in Iraq prior to 9/11 and after 9/11. So one of the members of Al-Qaeda, this guy called Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, had been, according to some reports, in contact with some of the people in the Ba'ath Party of Iraq. And for the United States, that connection between al-Zarqawi and some members of the Ba'ath Party, to them, was evidence, or at least they said it was evidence, that Al-Qaeda was operating with the support of Saddam Hussein himself, of the Iraqi government. And this is crucial in the context of the Bush administration's explanation of what foreign policy should look like. So if you look at National Security Strategy 2002, Chapter 3, you'll see that it says that in responding to the problem of global terrorism, that the United States will, quote, make no distinction between terrorists and those who knowingly harbor or provide aid to them. In other words, for the United States, terrorists and state sponsors of terrorism will be treated as one and the same kind of actor. The United States then, or the Bush administration then goes on to say in NSS 2002 that they will, quote, disrupt and destroy terrorist organizations by, among other things, quote, acting preemptively against such terrorists to prevent them from doing harm against our people and our country. Going on to say, quote, and denying further sponsorship and sanctuary by terrorists by convincing or compelling states to accept their sovereign responsibilities. So all of these things together, let's think about what NSS 2002 and what Colin Powell said in his speech. And what we can use those things to see what the Bush Doctrine was, right? So in other words, what the Bush Doctrine was that one, the United States would treat terrorists and state sponsors of terrorism as more or less the same thing. Two, that the U.S. would act preemptively to invade or to attack terrorists and terrorist sponsoring states preemptively if they believe that was in their national security interest. And three, in the context of Iraq, that because Iraq had sponsored terrorism, they argued, had been developing weapons of mass destruction, and had violated their interpretation of international norms under ceasefire established in 1990, 687. So in other words, what the Bush Doctrine stated were three important things, right? One, threats to the United States could come from non-state actors in addition to traditional state actors, in particular terrorists. So therefore, the United States could not treat foreign policy as something that was only shaped by states. It's something that's being shaped by these transnational actors. Two, since non-state actors are not rational, they have to be treated with in different ways. You cannot rely on deterrence in order to prevent attacks by non-state actors. And if you look at the UN Security Council statements, at the National Security Strategy statements in NSS 2002, and if you look at what Colin Powell says, there are all these references to things like that are called the nuclear mujahideen, right? And this kind of language of mujahideen is meant to invoke this kind of radical fundamentalist Islamic approach to foreign policy, right? You have non-state actors, they're not rational, and you have states that shall be treated as equivalent to the actors themselves, right? You combine that with the argument that the United States in this new post 9/11 world has the responsibility to act preemptively. All of those arguments were put together to rationalize an intervention and an invasion of Iraq. Was it worth it? Right? We had this invasion that was supposed to make the United States safer. And certainly, getting rid of Saddam Hussein was arguably a good thing. He was not a particularly progressive leader. He was certainly engaged in brutal repression of his own people and of the Kurds, which he didn't believe were his own people. Non-democratic actor. It's pretty repressive regime. But on the other hand, we ended up with a massively destabilized region. The power vacuum left by the destruction of Iraq, of the Iraqi government, the refusal to let the Ba'ath political party be involved in the reconstruction, even though the Ba'ath party and Baathists were the ones with all the political knowledge and history of organization, meant that you had this vacuum into which other actors could emerge. There are about 5,000 United States troops that died during the conflict, about 30,000 that were physically wounded or traumatized in some way. We spent about $2 trillion in combat and operations on the conflict. There were somewhere over 100,000 Iraqi civilians killed, although we can't really be sure because the reporting on Iraqi civilians killed in conflict has not really been that good. And as Mearsheimer and Walt argue, the stated goal, namely containing Saddam Hussein, preventing a destabilized region, it's not entirely clear that attacking Saddam Hussein would have been necessary to attain that goal, right? And their argument is that from a realist perspective, it would have made more sense to contain Iraq, even if they had developed nuclear weapons, than to go about doing what they saw as an unnecessary war. And I just want to highlight something here, right? As I mentioned early in the semester, when we spoke about Morgenthau and the idea of the use of power, the prudent use of power, realists do not advocate running around the world attacking anyone you can, right? Like, I get the impression sometimes that that's what people think realists say, but it's not what realists say. Realists believe that states do want to maximize power, that's true, but they argue that states tend to and should do so in a prudent, rational, calculated way. That's not to say that states don't sometimes make mistakes, and they pointed out that Saddam Hussein made several mistakes, particularly in his war with Kuwait, but they take pains to point out that he did so based on what could be a reasonable interpretation of the facts. On the other hand, the US invasion of Iraq, they say, had no clear geopolitical purpose from a realist perspective, and that was not something that made sense to them as scholars of international relations. So the takeaway from all of this, right, is we had a long and costly war from an invasion by the United States into Iraq, that this war was justified as a result of the United States attack by other actors, non-state actors based out of Afghanistan, and that these justifications and the ensuing foreign policy marked for many people a change in the way that the United States saw itself and treated itself in the world. Remember, the United States went to war with Iraq before. They went to war with Iraq in 1990, right? But at the time, they did not push for regime change or a transformation. That war was meant primarily to restore the sovereignty of Kuwait and then later to contain Iraq. This new war in which we went into this other country, wiped out their leader, and tried to engage in regime change at a cost of trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives lost, was different from the previous invasion in many important ways. And so states or at least the United States, argued that 9/11 represented a fundamental change in international relations that required a fundamentally new kind of foreign policy. And we can ask ourselves whether that conclusion makes sense and whether or not we have actually been made safer from terrorism as a result of the invasion of Iraq and similar interventions. All right, thank you. That's going to be it for today, and I'll see you guys next time.